Hello everybody, welcome to Haiku Talk. I'm your host, Ben Ga, your friendly neighborhood haiku poet. And today we're going to be taking a look at a piece from the latest issue of World Haiku Review from a gentleman named Cezar Ciobîcă. No, I'm getting that last name wrong. But from Cezar, with the first line of War Headlines. War Headlines. So with that, let's sit back, relax, grab a tasty beverage, and get ready to haiku. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to be with you again for episode 70 of Haiku Talk. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a piece from the latest issue of World Haiku Review. And their spring 2023 issue was a very war-themed issue, mostly centered on the conflict in Ukraine. And so if you're interested in reading some contemporary war-based haiku on that subject, please go check it out right there. Among all of the poems that I read, of course, some stand out more than others, and this one stood out to me in particularly because it has a couple different points of view all combined together in a single moment. And it's a very contradictory nature of war and youth and adulthood. And I don't know how to wrap my head around it other than to say that this does exist. And so without much further, let's take a look at the poem. The poem, and I'm going to say it's a haiku, but I think you could also make a case that this is a senru. But the poem goes like this. War Headlines. My grandson prepares his leaden soldiers. War Headlines. My grandson prepares his leaden soldiers. So why I think I'm calling this a haiku is that I think that because it deals with it is human nature, but the sort of the violence of the natural world, as well as perspectives between ages, which is a natural phenomenon. I'm going to go haiku with this, but I can completely support a case of that this is a senru because all of these things are all man-made objects, from the headlines to the making of a grandson to the leaden soldiers that the child is playing with, to war itself. That said, let's take a look at how the poem is structured. It does follow the fragment and phrase format, with the first line of War Headlines being the fragment, and the phrase being, my grandson prepares his leaden soldiers. Now that first line, War Headlines. War Headlines. It's rough. It's a rough first line. Not only because we hear it a lot in our own headlines today, it's still something that's talked about quite frequently, even though there's lots of other stuff going on in the world and going on in the news, at least in this country, the United States. It still is something that's on the forefront of people's minds. But it doesn't just have to be about this conflict. You read that first line and it brings that up, but it also brings up any number of headlines that you've read throughout your entire life. And the older you are, the more of those headlines you've read and the weightier that line feels. And that's part of the perspective piece of this poem that I find interesting, the contrasts of perspectives. Well, it's got the dot, dot, dot after headlines, which does, again, make you want to pause more. It's a real beard scratcher, you know. Let me think about that for a bit. Let me linger on what that means and what that says, you know. And it's especially cuts deeper if you have family members that have served, or you yourself have served, obviously. And so without getting stuck on that first line, which we do linger on for a while, we're compelled to read to line 2, which is, my grandson prepares. My grandson prepares. Now that, after war headlines, makes me think of the draft. It makes me think the grandson is going off to war, preparing to go to war. And that has all sorts of feelings that go with it. Some feelings of pride, for sure. Feelings of fear, for sure. Feelings of the unknown. Could be anger, could be patriotism, could be any number of things, and it could be all of them simultaneously. It's not a clear and cut response that one has to any of these things, you know. And then we go to line 3. His leaden soldiers. His leaden soldiers. And there's the rub here for me, and why this poem is a really good one, and why I went back and I've continued to chew on it since I've read it for the first time. Why is it that kids love to play war and love to play with soldiers and love to act out these violent games? And this has nothing to do with video games. Video games are a whole other subcategory, but it leads into that. You know, you like to play war games or you like to play board games. You know, there are plenty of strategic board games, you know, chess being one, that have to do with war and capturing and killing your king and queen and all the people. You know, I mean, it's a persistent thing that we as humans do. It's fascinating. As a kid, it's fun. I definitely played war. Definitely, you know, you took sides, good guys, bad guys, and, you know, had my toys. Didn't have leaden soldiers, but I had G.I. Joes, I had Transformers, I had, you know, any number of things that battled one another, you know, that were at war with one another. And now, as somebody I'm not a grandfather, I don't have kids, but getting to a point where I'm leaning more towards those grandfathered years. You know, you think of that. I think of that perspective of the grandson, of the grandfather watching, or grandmother, doesn't necessarily have to be a grandfather, the grandparent looking at their grandson playing with their soldiers, having the grandparent just read war headlines, and all of those feelings that happen in this one moment. I mean, think about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words. Look at all the stuff that's happening in this one moment that's captured there. Very, very well written, very, very well put together, well constructed, great word choice, and just left in this moment of watching this scene. And I don't know. It's part of why it's going to continue to cycle. As long as young people are trained in some ways to think war is fun and cool and something that you want to play, you want to act out, will always be here. And it's also not to say that the grandparent here is looking at the grandson and thinking bad thoughts or scared thoughts or worried thoughts. It could very well be pride. The grandfather could have served in the war. Grandparent could have served in the war. and is looking at the next generation. And, it could be a very patriotic, very, very, very family-oriented, strong scene happening here. Certainly that's justified and warranted in the poem. It plays out beautifully under that context. But I think it's one of these poems that is going to get into you, going to scratch into your psyche, and it's going to move you in some way. I don't think you can read a poem like this and not be pulled into one direction or another, or at least be conflicted, because it's just captured so well, And it's a poem about watching. Whenever we as poets are writing, especially haiku and senryu poets, we're observing the world, and we try to write these moments down in a way that allows, the readers to step in, see the moment, feel what's going on, and make it their own. But this one almost it's the observer from the outside is not the grandparent per se. I guess it's my grandson. So we're brought into this, we're hearing this moment, we're watching the scene, but there's also, I find myself being detached a little bit and not being able to solely inhabit the my grandson, the my of the poem. I'm split between that character. I'm split between remembering what it was like to be that grandson's age and playing with toys. And I'm also, as an observer, just watching the scene on the outside thinking like, gosh, why is this happening? It's a multiple layered experience for me. And this kind of complexity here in the experience is not one that we've visited often on the channel. I can't say we haven't visited at all, because I'm sure we can find examples if you look back at the previous 69 episodes where you could find an example of someone like this. But this one really is it's just complicated. I just sit with it. And I like that. It makes me a little uncomfortable because of all the conflicting thoughts and emotions and feelings that I have around what's going on in it. In this very, in a sense, peaceful scene. And it's great to have a poem this short be able to convey that much and move somebody that much, So I'd be curious if you feel inclined to leave a comment on where this poem puts you. Don't want it to necessarily be a political thing. It's not about politics here specifically. Nobody's calling out anybody out, but you can't not talk about war and not have politics enter into it. But it's not calling out one side against another per se. We don't know what the conflict is. It happened to show up in the context of an issue of a journal that was focused largely on the war in Ukraine. But it doesn't spell that out specifically. We know that from context of what the time that this poem was written or at least published, and the issue that it came out in. But as years go on, this is a poem that will definitely stand outside of that issue from World Haiku Review because it's not specifically tied to Ukraine by name, and it's one that we can revisit in any conflict because, like it or not, we're going to come across war headlines in our future as conflicts come and go. It's just part of the history books. And the older we get, the older I get, your attitudes change. You think about things in a slightly different way, and you have these memories of the younger you and the current you, and sometimes there's conflict. In my mind, for me, when I look at that grandparent and I see like a furrowed brow, and I see kind of like this sitting back and just, watching the grandson play. And I probably would just continue to watch the grandson play. I don't know what to say. And the poem doesn't say it either. It leaves that up to us to sit and stew with, which is important with haiku. They're not didactic. They don't tell you which way to go. They don't prescribe a side. They're not trying to sway you into any sort of line of thinking. They want you to drop you in a moment and make up your own minds. Now, sometimes the moment can be pretty compelling to show you a specific type of event that happened in a certain way, but you're still up to you to make your own conclusions. And so, yeah, war headlines. It's a good one. Thank you, Cezar. Thank you, World Haiku Review. Thank you, dear viewers, for tuning in to episode 70 of Haiku Talk. With that said, this episode's going to draw to a close. Thanks for tuning in. You know the drill. Like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. And until next time, peace.